Have you ever thought about whether it's still possible to invent a new type of melee weapon? And by that I don't mean a different take on an old concept or a recombination of features or anything like that. No, I mean an entirely new category. The same way as back when firearms were first developed, that was something new. Like ranged weapons existed, but the idea of propelling projectiles with contained explosions was something entirely new, right? The same way as the very first bow. The first atlatl was new, but it's not that dramatically different from throwing something with your arm. A bow is quite a different concept. When people design new weapons in fantasy scenarios, and just for fun or whatever, or for movies, it's generally a different array of things that have been already, right? For example, when Landsknecht Emporium made the design that I came up with, which is really not so much a new design, it's again a hybridization, of existing things. A bit of Messer, a bit of Khopesh, make it two-handed, give it a complex hilt, all this kind of stuff. That was not inventing a new weapon, at least not in the way I mean right now. You can say that, yeah, that's a new weapon. By recombining things, you're inventing something new. Fair enough, you can say that. But I mean, again, something that is completely different and also practical, and that's kind of a big caveat here. Because there's been so many things in, again, movies and video games that are completely different. If you think of the tall man's spheres, for example, that's some crazy stuff. That does not fit into any conventional category, right? Of course, it doesn't work in the real world, or at least currently. And that's where I can see things possibly happening in the future if you have very new tech. Some sort of laser or plasma weapon or anti-gravity shenanigans, or, well, maybe not so much anti-gravity, but like gravity manipulation. Like if you can point a high-tech wand at someone and you subject them to 100 times gravity. Boom, right? That's that sort of thing. And there are things that are not melee weapons that are something entirely different. For example, there are these, I forgot what they're called exactly, but basically pain compliance rays, like some sort of microwave or infrared wave or whatever it was, that's emitted that causes intense pain in the target without actually inflicting injuries. Or some kind of sonic disruptor, or an entirely new way of propelling projectiles. There's definitely lots of things that could happen in the future, and some already have. This could also apply to melee weapons. Something that, I mean, sabers are the typical thing that comes to everyone's mind. Maybe eventually something will come up that only requires you to touch a target and it disintegrates or immolates or who knows what, like borderline magic. Because extremely advanced technology you don't understand might as well be magic to you, right? Maybe it'll eventually be something that just teleports matter out of the target. Like you point it at something or someone and it just it causes a hole suddenly because it teleports flesh out of the body somewhere else, or wormholes it, or who knows what, like insane stuff like that. You can imagine all kinds of things, which people of course do. But what about something that's still doable, like that's feasible with conventional means, but is something new entirely? That's also practical, and that's the tricky thing. For example, if you take hafted weapons, that is a category, of course. So it doesn't quite apply to what I'm focusing on here, but just as an example, you can mount anything to a haft. Like anything. It doesn't matter really, as long as you can attach it. Historically, there have been so many things. Disc maces, conventional maces, whatever conventional means. Moor picks or antler, mounting basically dagger blades like that, hammers, etc., etc. So many things, right? In all kinds of different shapes of each type. And you can take anything. Like you can take a bottle of painkillers and fill them with lead shot and attach that to a haft. Okay, it's not going to be very durable, but if you fill like a tin can with lead shot and then you hit someone with it, whatever, yeah. Saw blades, so many things can just be improvised. But it's still the same category, it's still a hafted weapon. So you can hit something or someone with an object attached to a haft at a perpendicular angle or at some other angles. Has been done a lot in all kinds of different ways, right? Swords, obviously, is an entire huge category. All sorts of shapes and sizes, okay. Different purposes. Some are cut and thrust, some are almost exclusively for cutting or even entirely exclusively. Some just for thrusting or ideally for thrusting, so on and so forth, right? Okay, then you have things that project forward from the hand, that's strapped to the hand, for example, or are held there and conform to the forearm like a pata or a katar. There's been a number of takes on that, such a staggering variety of pole arms, which again is hafted claws, like wrist or arm mounted claws, not exactly common in history. Flexible weapons, all sorts, but something completely new. I suppose you could say that the modern self-defense weapon is sort of a category on its own. From Kubotans to various knuckle duster designs, all kinds of stuff. Because that all has certain constraints that don't apply to other melee weapons, like portability, concealability, things like that. Ideally, quite often they have tool use as well. Often they're designed to bypass prohibitions. This is a category of its own, I would argue. Within that you have subcategories. Then there are things that sort of deviate from all of that, like for example the spiky. You can file it under modified knuckle duster. I would argue it's something else. I would argue that's a different sort of category. So that's an example of something that has indeed been invented, something new in recent times. Right, so that can still happen, of course. If you wanted something that's comparable in effectiveness to a mace or axe or sword, that's going to be more difficult, I think, because everything has been done. Like, particularly when you look at other places, when you look at historical weapons from China and especially India, there's so many things that from a Western point of view look like fantasy. If I had seen just a drawing of some of these out of context, not knowing that it's based on something real, I would have said ridiculous nonsense. Why would you design that? In some cases, not all, but they're real. So I do think it's probably still possible to come up with something even conventional or made with conventional means and materials and everything that's not just a recombination of old elements, that is practical and that is melee. Again, more likely in this sort of modern self-defense category, I feel like, in that level of effectiveness, I want to say, because those are good for their intended, maybe good for their intended purpose. Many of them are. Many of them are gimmicky trash. All right, they're just there to take your money. Generally, none of them can compete with, again, a sword or machete or axe, let alone a polearm. Right, so could we come up with something that's similarly effective, that's not just a variation of something existing? I doubt it. I really don't think so. kind of think that humanity has pretty much exhausted the pool of potential melee weapons under these constraints. A radically new melee weapon based on future tech, again, is a different story. Although I do find range options more likely. That's kind of the path we're on now. But who knows? Maybe if something like the Dune shields happened, then you would get a different sort of weapon to counter that, because that's always been the arms race in history. People come up with a new kind of protection, personal protection, whether it be armor or defensive tools, and then weapons are modified or new ones are made to circumvent that defensive option or make it less effective or what have you, right? So that could still happen. There's just less pressure. There's less pressure on the need for that, because again, we're on the ranged weapons path. But even when you look back at history, when melee weapons still coexisted with firearms and were still used, there was nothing radically new, really, in terms of swords and sabers and all that. They kept kind of alternating between straight and curved, and experimenting with different, kinds of, not even really experimenting, but different types of blades were fashionable, if you will, at certain times, and more popular than others, or whatever, or adopted by the military for a while and then replaced by a different model, etc., all of that. But nothing revolutionary. Like, nothing came up in, say, the 17th or 18th or 19th century that was radically different than anything they had in the 15th or 16th, right? And in a lot of cases, I would argue it was more of a downgrade. Personal preference, but like less functionality. Anyway, let me know what you think. I've monologued enough, and I just want to bring this topic up, and maybe some of you have some ideas, radical new ideas for something that hasn't been done yet and is practical. Feel free to share in the comments, and thanks for watching.